The enemy was closing in. Victory was all but assured for them. For days, the skies were filled with the roar of their warships, their armies sweeping across the land with unrelenting force. Cities fell, and humanity's last hope seemed like nothing more than a fading ember in a storm of destruction. It was the kind of defeat that left no room for escape, no chance for survival. For everyone watching, it seemed like the end was near. But they didn't know about us, humanity. It's not something they understood, our relentless spirit, our refusal to yield in the face of certain doom. Our enemy thought they had won, that our world was just another conquest to add to their list. But they underestimated something crucial, us. In the darkest hours, when all hope seemed lost, something stirred. A group of fighters, ordinary people who lost everything, found the strength to rise against impossible odds. They weren't soldiers. They weren't leaders. They were everyday men and women, farmers, teachers, engineers, and children, who had never imagined they'd be called to fight. Yet when the call came, they stood tall. What they lacked in experience, they made up for in sheer determination. With nothing but their wits, their willpower, and a raw, unshakable love for their world, they became the last line of defense. In those early moments, when it seemed like all was lost, something happened. A series of small victories began to stack up. What started as one brave soul standing against the tide became a movement. Those who once thought they had nothing left found strength in each other. In the face of overwhelming odds, they became a beacon of hope, reminding the invaders what humanity was capable of when pushed to the brink. The resistance wasn't some grand army with flawless tactics. It was a collection of individuals, thrown together by fate, fighting with everything they had. And it wasn't just the soldiers on the front lines that mattered. In the shadows, engineers worked day and night to build weapons from scraps, while scientists found ways to counter the enemy's superior technology. The old world was gone, but a new, even more powerful version of humanity was emerging. It was a people united by the sheer will to survive, to protect their families, their homes, and their future. But just as the resistance was beginning to make its mark, the enemy adapted. Their commanders devised new strategies, bringing out their most devastating weapons, more advanced than anything humanity had ever seen. As the odds grew even more insurmountable, it seemed like the resistance's flicker of hope might be snuffed out for good. Desperation crept in, and every victory seemed followed by an even worse defeat. And yet, there was still a spark. The invaders underestimated the resilience of those they had conquered, never fully understanding the depth of our resolve. What they didn't count on was the way we fight, not just with weapons, but with our hearts and minds. But in those final, fateful moments, when all seemed lost, a plan was put into motion, a plan that could turn the tide of battle once and for all, if only it didn't come at an unimaginable cost. As the enemy tightened their grip, humanity's last hope relied on a single dangerous mission. It was the kind of operation that could either destroy the invaders for good or completely obliterate everything left of humanity's way of life. The countdown had begun, and only time would tell if the human spirit was enough to overcome the impossible. Would they be able to pull off the unthinkable and save their world? Or was this the final stand before humanity was erased from existence? The answer, as always, lay in the hands of those who would never quit, and their story is only just beginning. Stay tuned. As the team scrambled through the enemy base, the air felt charged with urgency. Every footstep echoed too loudly. Every breath seemed too deep. The buzzing of the surveillance drones overhead was almost deafening, like a constant reminder that their every move was being watched. There was no room for error now. They had breached the perimeter, but they hadn't accounted for this, the swift reaction of the enemy, who were now pouring into the facility in full force. They were no longer infiltrators. They were intruders fighting for their survival. The doctor's heart raced as she sprinted through the narrow corridors, trying to stay one step ahead of the rapidly advancing enemy forces. Sweat dripped down her brow, but her focus remained sharp. The mission had started as a desperate hope, a last-ditch effort to turn the tide of the war. Now it was a fight to stay alive long enough to see it through. She glanced at the faces of her team members, each one determined, each one fully aware that they were facing a one-way trip. Behind her, the sounds of enemy footsteps grew louder, closer. The team had only a few minutes before they would be trapped. The doctor's mind raced as she scanned the blueprint of the base in her head, the plan they'd painstakingly memorized. They needed to reach the central control room, where the core systems that powered the enemy's war machines were stored. If they could shut it all down, the enemy's forces would be rendered useless. It was humanity's best shot, and it was slipping away with every passing second. They turned a corner, and there it was, the entrance to the control room, the final hurdle. But the door was sealed tight, locked by a high-security code that they hadn't anticipated. Time was running out. The team's hacker, a quiet and brilliant young man, was already at work on the terminal, his fingers flying across the keypad in a blur. His face was tense, his eyes flickering from the screen to the hallway beyond, listening for the inevitable sound of the enemy's approach. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the heavy thud of their pursuers' boots. The doctor didn't have time to wait. She glanced down the hallway again. The flickering light of the drones grew nearer, their harsh beams casting shadows across the walls. She could hear the voice of the enemy commander over the loudspeakers, barking orders to his forces. They were only moments away from being discovered. "Almost there," the hacker said, his fingers still moving with precision. "Just a few more seconds." But the seconds were slipping away faster than they could count. The doctor felt a cold wave of panic creep over her, threatening to overtake her calm exterior. She had to trust the plan. They had no choice but to trust it. The seconds seemed to stretch into an eternity. The doctor's heart pounded as she pressed herself against the cold metal wall, every sense alert to the faintest sound. She could hear the faint hum of the base's power systems, the creak of machinery in the distance, and the rapid, erratic breaths of her teammates, all moving in sync, hoping beyond hope that the door would open before the enemy arrived. The hacker's hands were a blur, but despite his skill, the lock seemed to mock them, refusing to yield. Sweat dripped down his forehead, his concentration unbroken even as the seconds stretched longer. The doctor looked back down the hallway, biting her lip. The distant noise of boots growing louder, closer. The enemy was almost there, and their only chance was slipping through their fingers. "Come on," she whispered under her breath. Her voice barely made a sound against the growing pressure in her chest. She knew that if they didn't get through that door in the next few moments, it would be over. "Done," the hacker breathed out in a voice barely above a whisper. His eyes were wide, a look of disbelief flickering in them as the door's security systems finally disengaged with a soft, mechanical click. Without wasting a moment, the doctor and the others rushed forward, diving through the open doorway and into the dimly lit control room. The door slammed shut behind them, and for a fleeting moment, there was a brief sense of relief. They were inside. They had made it, but that relief was short-lived, replaced by the urgency of their task. The room was cluttered with monitors, wires, and blinking lights, far more advanced than anything they'd encountered before. The doctor's mind raced as she looked around, taking in the complex systems. She had no experience with this kind of technology, but she had studied enough to understand the importance of what they were doing. They had to disable the central hub, but time was running out. The countdown had already started, the enemy closing in on their location. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, the tension, the pressure mounting by the second. The hacker wasted no time, rushing to one of the main terminals and connecting his equipment to the network. He began typing furiously, his face illuminated by the screen's eerie glow. "We're in," he said, voice tight with intensity. "I've bypassed their encryption. This is it. Just give me a few seconds to trigger the shutdown sequence." But as he worked, something shifted. The walls seemed to close in, the atmosphere growing thicker with each passing moment. The doctor's skin prickled. It was too quiet now, too still. And then the harsh, unmistakable sound of a door being blown open from the outside echoed through the room. The enemy was here. Gunfire erupted down the hallway, followed by shouts and commands from the invaders. The door they had come through was no longer secure. The team's chances of escape were rapidly diminishing. "Get it done now," the doctor shouted, her voice urgent as she grabbed a nearby rifle, ready to defend their position. The hacker's hands were shaking, but he didn't stop. Almost there. Just a few more seconds. Behind her, the doctor could hear the rapid footsteps of the enemy closing in. The tension in the room reached a breaking point. They were about to make history, or be obliterated in the process. Her mind raced as she prepared for the inevitable confrontation. They had no backup, no reinforcements. It was them against a far superior enemy. But this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about showing the invaders what humanity was capable of when pushed to the edge. One last push, she thought. They had to hold on just a little longer. The hacker's fingers flew across the terminal, the screen flashing with lines of code as the shutdown sequence initiated. They were moments away from the end, but as the countdown reached its final seconds, the door to the control room burst open. The enemy had arrived. The doctor raised her rifle, her breath sharp in her throat. There was no turning back now. The door to the control room slammed open, and the enemy rushed in. The doctor's grip tightened around the rifle as the sound of boots hitting the floor reverberated through the room. They were here. The moment she had been dreading had arrived. Her heart raced, but she forced herself to focus. There was no time for fear, only action. The enemy soldiers, heavily armed and well-trained, flooded the room, weapons raised. A cold chill settled over her. She had no idea how many were coming, but she knew they didn't have the luxury of time. The hacker's hands were still hovering over the terminal, trying desperately to finish the shutdown sequence. "Get down," someone shouted as gunfire ripped through the air. The doctor hit the floor, rolling to the side, narrowly avoiding the burst of bullets that tore through the space where she had been standing just a second ago. She scrambled behind a console, trying to steady her breathing. Her eyes flicked to the hacker, who was still working furiously, completely unaware of the chaos unfolding around him. "We have to buy him time," she shouted, aiming her rifle at the advancing enemy soldiers. The first few shots barely missed their targets, ricocheting off the walls as the doctor's hands shook with adrenaline. The room erupted into chaos as the enemy closed in, returning fire. She ducked behind a table just as another round shattered the console she had been hiding behind. Sparks flew. Her mind raced. She had trained for this. She had been prepared for danger. But nothing could have prepared her for this. A battle against a force that seemed endless, with no backup in sight, no reinforcements to call. Just then, the door slammed shut with a heavy metallic thud. The doctor's stomach dropped. It wasn't the enemy locking them in. It was something worse. The room had sealed itself off from the outside world. They were trapped. Panic threatened to rise in her chest, but she crushed it down, focusing instead on the bigger picture. The mission was still their only hope. Almost there. The hacker's voice rang out, barely audible over the gunfire. His face was drenched in sweat, his fingers frantic as they moved over the terminal. The countdown on the screen had stopped moving. There was still no shutdown, no signal that they had succeeded. "Why isn't it working?" the doctor demanded, pressing her back against the wall, trying to steady her rifle. The hacker's eyes darted to the screen, confusion and dread spreading across his face. It's not supposed to be like this. Something's wrong." He paused, his breath hitching. "The enemy has a failsafe. They knew someone would try this. They've locked me out of the system." The doctor's pulse quickened as she looked around, desperation creeping into her voice. "What do you mean, locked you out?" "I can't finish the shutdown sequence," he said, his hands shaking. "The base is rigged to trigger a counterstrike if anyone tries to disable the systems. They've been watching us. They knew we were coming. They let us in." The words hit like a punch to the gut. The truth dawned on her with terrifying clarity. This wasn't just a mission to shut down enemy tech. It was a trap. The entire facility had been designed to lure them in, to bait them into trying to disable their operations, only to trigger a devastating retaliation. The doctor felt the weight of that revelation sink into her bones. "Get out of there," she shouted, but it was too late. The door to the control room was already beginning to seal again, this time from the inside. They were locked in, surrounded by enemies, with a failsafe system primed to end it all. The countdown on the terminal flickered again, this time with a warning message flashing across the screen. Asterisk asterisk system breach imminent. Self-destruct sequence engaged asterisk asterisk. The stakes had just been raised beyond anything they had anticipated. Now, the mission wasn't just about survival. It was a race against time to stop a nuclear strike that could wipe out everything left of humanity's last stand. They weren't just fighting to shut down the enemy's machines anymore. They were fighting to prevent the end of the world. The doctor's mind raced as she looked at the countdown. There was no escaping the fallout if the failsafe completed. She turned to the hacker, who was now visibly panicked. "We have to stop it. We have no choice." The countdown on the terminal blazed in front of them, a cruel reminder of how much time they had left. The self-destruct sequence was already in motion, and the hacker's desperate attempts to regain control were proving futile. Each keystroke he made was swallowed by the system, only to be met with a new error message. They were running out of time, fast. The doctor's mind raced as she looked around the control room. The walls were closing in, the noise of enemy soldiers growing louder as they fought their way closer. But the real danger wasn't the soldiers. It was the countdown, steadily ticking away toward their inevitable doom. The base was designed for this exact moment, to prevent any intruder from escaping or succeeding. They had been caught in a trap, and unless they acted fast, it would all be over. "Can you bypass the failsafe?" she shouted at the hacker, urgency coloring every word. His fingers flew across the keys, his face pale and strained. I can try, but it's built into the core systems. Even if I manage to get past the locks, it might be too late." The doctor looked at the countdown again. 30 seconds. They had less than a minute. Her pulse hammered in her ears, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of the world pressing down on her. The survival of their entire resistance depended on the hacker's ability to override the system. If he failed, humanity would never stand a chance. A thought flickered through her mind, dark and fleeting, but it was there. What if they didn't need to escape? What if there was another way to stop the countdown? She pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the task at hand. They had to finish what they started. Behind her, the enemy was almost at the door, and she could hear the shout of a commanding officer giving orders. It wouldn't be long before they were overwhelmed. "Keep trying," she barked at the hacker, her voice cutting through the tension. He didn't respond. His eyes were locked on the screen, a look of determination etched into his face. The countdown hit 10 seconds. The doctor's mind flashed to her family, to everything she had lost, and to everything she was still fighting for. The hacker's screen began to flash a series of numbers, and she realized he was getting closer. But it was going to be close. Too close. 5 seconds, she yelled. "Hurry." The hacker slammed his hand down on the terminal, his voice barely a whisper. "It's now or never." The screen went blank. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, just as the doctor braced herself for the worst, the lights in the room flickered, then stabilized. The countdown stopped. She froze, unable to believe what she was seeing. The system had stopped. The self-destruct had been deactivated. But then, before she could fully comprehend their success, the walls of the room shuddered. A low rumble reverberated through the ground, and the base began to shake violently. A new message flashed across the terminal screen. Asterisk asterisk failsafe deactivated. Core systems compromised asterisk asterisk. The ground beneath them cracked open, and in that instant, the final twist of the mission became clear. The enemy had anticipated this too. The base wasn't just rigged with a self-destruct. It was designed to collapse in on itself once the failsafe was broken. They had disabled the countdown, but the entire base was now coming apart. "What the hell is happening?" the doctor gasped. The hacker's eyes widened with realization. "We've triggered the secondary fail state. The whole base is going down." Panic surged. They were too deep inside to escape now. But as the walls began to collapse around them, the doctor's mind raced for a solution. There had to be a way out. There was always a way. Then, in the distance, through the chaos, she heard something unexpected. A voice, clear and cold, crackling through the communication system. "Not so fast," the voice said. It was the enemy commander. But it wasn't just a message. It was a warning. They weren't the only ones who had planned for this moment. The commander had been watching the entire time. The doctor's blood ran cold. They had been played from the start. The trap wasn't just the base. It was humanity's last hope. The countdown had been just the beginning. The voice of the enemy commander crackled through the speakers, cold and mocking. Did you really think you could stop this? The moment you disabled the failsafe, you sealed your fate. There's no escape. Humanity's reign is over. The doctor's heart pounded in her chest as the realization hit. They weren't just fighting to save themselves. They were the last hope for humanity. This wasn't some last-minute battle. It was the final stand, and the enemy had already anticipated their every move. The doctor's mind raced. They were trapped in the belly of the beast, with no clear way out. But one thing was certain, giving up was not an option. She glanced around the control room, the walls cracking as the base trembled. The flickering lights reflected the chaos unfolding, and the sound of rumbling metal grew louder by the second. Their surroundings were literally falling apart, but there was a strange sense of clarity in the chaos. The mission was never just about shutting down a system. It had always been about proving to the enemy that humanity could withstand their greatest challenge, no matter the odds. The hacker, still huddled by the terminal, looked up at the doctor with a grim expression. It's over. The core's been destabilized. Nothing we do can stop it now. For a moment, the doctor was frozen. It felt as if time itself had stopped, and the weight of their failure crashed down on her. But then something shifted. In the distance, she could hear the sounds of their comrades, members of the resistance, waiting for a signal. A signal that, for the first time, wasn't a false hope. She turned back to the hacker, her voice steady despite the madness unfolding. Can you still access the main reactor controls? His eyes widened with realization. You're thinking of something crazy, aren't you? I don't care if it's crazy, she shot back, her voice hard. We still have a shot at stopping this, but we need to get to the core now. I know we're out of time, but we can still turn this around. The hacker hesitated, his fingers dancing across the terminal one more time, as if searching for the impossible. The doctor turned to the others, her team, who had been watching this unfold with wide eyes, and nodded. We're not finished yet. With every second feeling like an eternity, they moved through the base, narrowly avoiding collapsing walls and sections of the floor that gave way under the pressure. The doctor led the way, her determination surging in the face of all odds. They weren't just fighting to save their lives anymore. They were fighting to give humanity a chance to survive, to prove that even in the darkest hours, they could still overcome the impossible. When they finally reached the reactor core, the air was thick with the hum of unstable power. The hacker connected his device to the main system, and the terminal buzzed to life. This is it, the hacker said, his voice tight. If this works, we might just save the world, but I can't guarantee it. The doctor's heart skipped a beat. This was the final moment. With a deep breath, she steadied herself, knowing that their fate rested on the next few actions. If they failed, everything would be gone. Humanity, the resistance, the future. The hacker hit the final command, and for a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then the base's tremors began to slow. The lights flickered, but they stayed on. The countdown, which had been inching toward zero, halted completely. A collective breath escaped everyone in the room. They had done it. The reactor was stable. But as the doctor looked around at the ruins of the facility, the burning wreckage of what was once an enemy stronghold, she understood. The fight wasn't over. The battle for humanity's future had only just begun. They had won this round, but the war was far from over. As the team made their way out of the wreckage, the doctor couldn't help but think of all those who had fought beside them. They had proven something essential today, that even when all seemed lost, humanity's spirit could never be extinguished. It wasn't just about survival. It was about hope, resilience, and the unyielding will to keep fighting, no matter the cost. And with that, the mission was complete. But the war, humanity's war, had only just begun.